Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I needed this trip. After months of dealing with back-to-back projects and barely any time off, my company finally approved my request for a business conference out west. My co-worker was coming along, and we decided to make the drive instead of flying. The scenery would be worth it, and honestly, I just needed the break from everything. We'd been on the road since early morning, driving through endless stretches of desert and mountains. By midday, we were both starving and pulled off at the first restaurant we saw. It was one of those chain diners, sitting alone off the highway in the middle of nowhere, Utah. The parking lot was almost empty, which seemed perfect. We just wanted a quiet meal before getting back on the road. When we walked in, the place was deserted. Maybe one or two other tables occupied in the whole restaurant. The waitress greeted us with a tired smile and told us to sit wherever we wanted. We picked a corner booth by the window, far from everyone else. Nice and quiet. She came over, took our drink orders, and headed back to the kitchen. I was just starting to relax, looking at the menu and thinking about what I wanted to eat, when the door opened. A man walked in, looked around at all the empty tables and booths, and made a beeline straight for the booth right next to ours. Right next to us, in an empty restaurant. Before we could even process why someone would do that, he pulled out his phone, put it on speaker, and started screaming into it. His voice bounced off the walls. The whole restaurant could hear every word. He was arguing with his wife about airline tickets, not just talking, screaming. About Southwest Airlines, about whether his mother needing wheelchair assistance meant they could all board early, about how much long-term parking was going to cost them. My co-worker and I looked at each other. This couldn't be real. There were dozens of empty tables. He could have sat anywhere. But no, he chose a spot right next to us and decided to have the loudest, most obnoxious phone conversation possible. The conversation kept getting worse. His wife apparently had her brother join the call, and suddenly there were three people yelling over each other. They switched to what I assumed was their native language, but the volume didn't change. If anything, it got louder. The man was gesturing wildly, slamming his hand on the table, completely oblivious or completely uncaring about the fact that other people existed. I tried to focus on the menu. My co-worker tried to do the same, but every few seconds, the man would shout something else and we'd both flinch. I could feel my jaw clenching. This was supposed to be a peaceful lunch, a break from stress. Instead, I was sitting here listening to a stranger's entire family drama at full volume. I turned and gave him a look, not still, a full-on glare. He glared right back at me and kept shouting. My co-worker did the same thing. Nothing. The guy didn't care. The waitress came back with our drinks, clearly uncomfortable. She could hear everything too. She tried to take our orders, but we couldn't even hear ourselves think over the noise. She apologized and said she'd come back in a minute. That's when something snapped. I wasn't going to sit here and let this guy ruin our meal. If he wanted to be loud and obnoxious, fine. Two could play that game. I stood up, grabbed my phone, and walked over to the booth on the other side of him. Now his booth was sandwiched between mine and my co-worker's. I called my co-worker. He looked confused for half a second, then his face broke into a grin. He answered, "Put me on speaker." I put him on speaker, and we started shouting. I yelled that I didn't care what time it was because I was having French toast. My co-worker shouted back that he hoped they did the thing where they give you the extra milkshake in the metal cup. The man's head whipped around. He looked at me, then at my co-worker, then back at me. He covered one ear with his hand and started yelling even louder into his phone. We could hear his wife and brother-in-law getting more agitated on the other end. The waitress came back, tray in hand, and froze. She looked at us, looked at the man, and then I saw it click. She was trying so hard not to laugh. My co-worker yelled at me to ask the waitress if they had hash browns or home fries. I shouted the question at her. She told us they had both. I screamed back to my co-worker that they had both options. My co-worker hollered that he wanted hash browns and that he wanted them extra crispy. The waitress was fully in on it now. She walked over to my co-worker's booth, notepad out, playing along. She told him to ask me how I wanted my eggs. He screamed the question across the restaurant. I yelled back that I wanted them scrambled with cheese. She shouted, asking what kind of toast. I bellowed back, asking my coworker what kinds they had. He roared that they had wheat, white, or sourdough. I screamed that I wanted sourdough. This went on for 2 full minutes. The man was turning red. He kept shooting us furious looks, but we didn't stop. Every time he tried to yell into his phone, we yelled louder. His family on the other end must have been so confused. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, his face purple with rage, and screamed at us that we were effing a-holes. He stormed out of the restaurant, phone still pressed to his ear, still arguing with his family when he slammed the door behind him. The second he was gone, my coworker and I burst out laughing. The waitress was laughing too, wiping tears from her eyes. We hung up our phones and went back to sitting at the same table like normal people. She brought us our food, and we ate in complete, beautiful silence. When the check came, we left her the biggest tip we could manage. She deserved it. Best lunch I'd had in months. I've always been a light sleeper. The smallest noise can wake me up, and once I'm awake, that's pretty much it for me. My brother is the complete opposite. When we were kids, our parents used to have to physically shake him awake every morning for school. They'd turn on all the lights, open the curtains, even play music, and he'd still be out cold. It was like trying to wake up a hibernating bear. When we got older, things didn't really change. He started using an alarm clock, but here's the thing. He'd set it, and it would go off in his room, but he wouldn't wake up. I would. Our bedrooms share a wall, and every single morning I'd be jolted awake by this obnoxious beeping coming from his side. I'd lie there for a few minutes, hoping he'd turn it off, but nope. Eventually, I have to drag myself out of bed, walk into his room, and physically shake him until he woke up enough to turn the thing off. This went on for years. I never really said anything about it because honestly, what was the point? He couldn't help being a heavy sleeper, and I figured it was just one of those annoying sibling things you deal with. Last year, my brother got his first real job at a retail store. He was so excited about it. He loved the work, loved his co-workers, and for the first time in his life, he was genuinely motivated to get up in the morning. The alarm situation actually improved for a while. He was waking up on time, getting ready without issue, and everything seemed fine. But then, about a month ago, things started going downhill. He was late to work. Not by much, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but enough that his manager noticed. When I asked him what happened, he told me he'd woken up when his alarm went off, but then closed his eyes for just a second and fell back asleep. I told him it happens to everyone sometimes and not to worry about it. Then it happened again and again. By the fourth time, his manager had pulled him aside and given him a warning. My brother was freaking out. He loved this job and didn't want to lose it over something so stupid. He promised himself he'd be more careful. A few days later, I was driving him to work after yet another close call. He'd woken up late again, and I'd agreed to give him a ride so he wouldn't be as late as he would have been if he'd taken the bus. We were sitting at a red light when he turned to me with this hopeful look on his face. He asked me if I could start checking on him in the mornings, like just to make sure he was actually up and getting ready. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to process what he was asking. I asked him if he wanted me to come into his room every morning and make sure he was awake. He said yeah, just for a little while, until he got better at waking himself up. He really couldn't afford to be late again. I told him no, I wasn't doing that. He looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to say no. He asked me why not. It would literally take me 2 seconds. I explained that he was 18 years old. He was an adult. If he wanted to play the closing your eyes after your alarm goes off game, that was on him. I wasn't going to be his personal wake-up service. He said he wasn't asking me to be his wake-up service. He was just asking for a little help. I asked him what would happen when I didn't wake him up one day. Was he going to blame me for being late? Because I knew him. He was going to make it my responsibility, and then when he was late again, it would somehow be my fault. He said that wasn't fair. I told him it was completely fair. He was asking me to take on a responsibility that should be his. He needed to figure this out on his own. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. When we got to the store, he got out without saying goodbye. I felt a little bad, but I also felt like I'd made the right call. He needed to learn how to handle this himself. Later that evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when my mom came in. She had this look on her face that told me she'd already talked to my brother. She told me that my brother said I wouldn't help him wake up in the mornings. I confirmed that was right. He was an adult. He needed to figure it out. She said she understood where I was coming from, but would it really be that hard to just check on him? If I was already up and moving, it would be a nice thing to do. I explained that I wasn't up and moving. When his alarm went off, I woke up and then I tried to go back to sleep. If I started checking on him, I'd be fully awake and I wouldn't be able to go back to sleep. She said it would just be common courtesy. He was my brother and he was asking for help. I told her he was asking me to take responsibility for something that was his problem. If I agreed to this and he was late again, he was going to blame me. I knew him. That's exactly what would happen. She said she thought I was being a little harsh. He was just trying to keep his job. I replied that I was just trying to set a reasonable boundary. She sighed and didn't push it any further, but I could tell she thought I was being unreasonable. I went to bed that night feeling conflicted. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh. Maybe it wouldn't be that big of a deal to just knock on his door in the morning. But the other part of me knew that if I started doing this, it would become expected, and eventually, it would be my fault if something went wrong. The next morning, his alarm went off at 6:30. I woke up just like always and lay there listening to it beep. I waited for him to turn it off, and waited, and waited. After about 5 minutes, I heard him shuffle around and finally silence it. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep, ignoring the tiny voice in my head that wondered if he'd actually gotten up or just hit snooze. I was at the playground with my son on a Saturday afternoon, watching him run around the climbing frame with the other kids. He'd been excited all morning about going to the park, and I was happy to see him having fun in the sunshine. I sat on a bench nearby, keeping an eye on him while he played. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon, and the playground was pretty busy, with families enjoying the weekend. My son was on the swings when I noticed a woman and her boy approaching him. The boy looked about the same age, maybe 7 or 8. I watched when they started talking to my son, and at first everything seemed normal. Kids make friends at playgrounds all the time, but then I saw the woman lean down and say something to my son, and his body language changed. He shook his head and backed away from the swings. I stood up and started walking over, something in my gut telling me this wasn't right. The woman grabbed my son's arm and started pulling him toward the parking lot. Her own son was following behind them, and my son was trying to pull away. I broke into a run. I shouted at her, demanding to know what she was doing and telling her to let go of my son. The woman turned to look at me but didn't let go of my son's arm. She had this entitled smile on her face like she hadn't done anything wrong. She told me my son was coming to play with them at their house because her boy wanted a friend over. I told her he wasn't going anywhere with her and demanded she let go of him right now. My son was crying now, pulling against her grip. Other parents at the playground had stopped what they were doing and were watching the scene unfold. She insisted that her son wanted to play with him and claimed they were getting along so well on the swings. I told her I didn't care what her son wanted and that was my child she needed to let go of immediately. I reached them and grabbed my son's other arm, trying to pull him away from her. She tightened her grip on him. She told me not to be selfish and said kids need play dates. She accused me of raising him to be antisocial. I asked her if she was insane and told her she couldn't just take someone's child. She finally let go, but only because my son twisted out of her grasp and ran behind me. I put myself between them and my son, my heart pounding. I thought she would walk away after that confrontation. I thought any reasonable person would realize how wrong this was. Instead, she grabbed my son again. This time, she was faster, darting around me, while I was still processing what was happening. She scooped him up and started running toward a car in the parking lot. Her own son was running alongside her, looking confused but following his mother. I chased after them, shouting for help. Other parents were pulling out their phones. My son was screaming and kicking, but she had a tight grip on him. She reached the blue sedan and yanked the back door open. She shoved my son inside next to her own son and slammed the door. I could hear the locks click. I pounded on the window, but she was already in the driver's seat. She started the engine while I was pulling on the door handle, trying desperately to get it open. She backed out of the parking space so fast I had to jump out of the way. I watched in horror when she drove away with my son in her car. I could see him through the back window, still crying and pressing his hands against the glass. Several other parents had rushed over. One of them told me they got her license plate and were calling 911 right now. Another parent said they got it on video and that the whole thing was on camera. A third parent told me they had taken photos of the woman in her car. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I dialed 911 and tried to explain what had happened. My voice kept breaking. The operator stayed calm and asked me questions. What did the car look like? What was the license plate number? What was my son wearing? I told her he was wearing a red shirt and blue shorts. I answered everything through tears while other parents crowded around me, offering support and giving their own statements to the operator. The playground had security cameras. The police arrived within 10 minutes and immediately pulled the footage. They could see everything. The woman approaching my son, the initial confrontation, the kidnapping, her car leaving the parking lot. They had her license plate clear when day. The officers took statements from me and the other witnesses. One father had recorded the entire incident on his phone from the moment she grabbed my son the second time. Another mother had photos of the woman's face before she got in the car. The police put out an alert. Every officer in the area was looking for that blue sedan. They told me the woman's license plate was registered to an address about 20 minutes away. I sat in the back of a police car wrapped in a blanket someone had given me even though it wasn't cold. I just couldn't stop shaking. One of the officers kept reassuring me that they would find my son and that this would end well. I wanted to believe him, but I felt sick. It was around 3:15 when they told me they had located the vehicle at the registered address. They were sending units to surround the house. They asked if I wanted to come with them or wait at the station. I said I needed to be there. It took less than 2 hours total from the kidnapping to when we arrived at her house. The license plate led them straight to her address across town. When I arrived with the police, there were already patrol cars surrounding the place. Officers had blocked off the street. They had megaphones out. Neighbors were coming out of their houses to see what was happening. An officer announced through the megaphone that this was the police and demanded she send the child outside now. He said the house was surrounded and there was no way out. I could barely breathe. I stood behind the police line watching the front door. After what felt like forever, it opened. The woman walked out with her hands up, looking annoyed rather than scared. She was actually arguing with the officers, saying this was all a misunderstanding. Her son followed her, looking terrified now. Behind him was my son. I broke past the police line and ran to him. He was crying and grabbed onto me, like he would never let go. I held him so tight, crying into his hair. The police arrested the woman right there on her front lawn. She was shouting something about how she just wanted her son to have a play date, how I was being dramatic, how she was going to bring him back eventually. She said her son had been lonely and just wanted a friend. She claimed I should be grateful she was trying to help my son make friends. The officers ignored her protests and put her in the patrol car. My son was checked by paramedics to make sure he was okay. Physically, he was fine, just scared. They checked him for any injuries and asked him questions to make sure he hadn't been hurt. We gave statements at the police station, and I learned she was being charged with kidnapping. The detective told me it was one of the most clear-cut cases they'd ever seen. Multiple witnesses and the playground cameras made it an open and shut case. The video evidence from the other parent's phone was particularly damning. They also found that she had no prior relationship with us and had never met my son before that day. The detective said the bail was set at $50,000. The last I heard, she was looking at serious prison time. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had mental health issues, but the prosecutor said that didn't excuse kidnapping. Her own son had been placed with family members. The boy's father had custody now and was reportedly horrified by what his ex-wife had done. I still can't believe someone could think it was okay to just take a child because their kid wanted a playmate. My son had nightmares for months afterward, but we got through it. I was stationed at Camp Pendleton back in the 80s. and honestly, most nights on base were pretty uneventful. I'd finish up whatever I was doing and head back to the barracks without much trouble. This one night, though, I was driving through base around 2 in the morning just trying to get some sleep before another early morning. Out of nowhere, this white truck pulls up behind me and sits right on my bumper. I'm talking close enough that I couldn't even see his grill in my rearview mirror. What made it worse was that he had his brights on, and all three of my mirrors were reflecting that light straight into my eyes. I couldn't see a damn thing. The road, the mirrors, everything was just white light burning into my retinas. I figured maybe he just didn't realize how close he was, so I eased on the gas a little bit, just a few miles per hour faster to put some space between us. Nothing crazy, but the second I sped up, he matched my speed and stayed glued to my bumper with those brights still blasting me. So I tried again, pressing the gas a little more to create some distance. That's when I saw the flashing lights. The white truck was a military police vehicle, and now I was getting pulled over for speeding. I pulled to the side of the road and waited while the military policeman walked up to my window. He was a lance corporal, which meant he was pretty junior in rank. He asked for my identification and immediately started writing me up for speeding. I tried explaining what happened, how he'd been riding my bumper with his brights on and I couldn't see anything, but he wasn't interested. He just kept saying I was speeding, and that was that. I could feel my frustration building because a speeding ticket on base wasn't just some minor inconvenience. It could seriously mess with my career advancement and get me in real trouble with my command. While we were going back and forth, another military police vehicle pulled up. This one was driven by a corporal, which meant he outranked the lance corporal who pulled me over. The corporal got out and asked what was going on. I explained the whole situation to him, how the lance corporal had been tailgating me with his brights on for several minutes, how I couldn't see anything in any of my mirrors, and how I only sped up slightly to try and create some safe distance between our vehicles. The corporal listened and then looked at the lance corporal. The lance corporal said I was speeding and that he'd clocked me going over the limit. The corporal asked him if it was true that he'd been on my bumper with his brights on. The lance corporal admitted he was behind me but said I was still speeding. The corporal told him that if he was tailgating me like that, he created the situation and there would be no ticket. The lance corporal started arguing with the corporal right there on the side of the road. I just stood there watching this junior guy argue with his superior about whether or not to give me a ticket. The argument went on for at least 5 minutes, with the lance corporal insisting I deserved the ticket and the corporal saying no. It was surreal watching someone argue with a higher rank like that, especially over something so petty. Finally, the corporal shut it down and told me I was free to go. No ticket. The lance corporal looked pissed, but couldn't really do anything about it. I thanked the corporal and got back in my vehicle, hoping that would be the last time I'd see that military policeman. A few months went by and I'd mostly forgotten about the incident. I was working shooting range coach by then, which meant I spent a lot of time at the rifle range helping other Marines qualify with their weapons. Every Marine has to qualify once a year, and if you don't pass, you can face serious disciplinary action. My job was to instruct and monitor during live fire exercises, making sure everyone stayed safe and followed proper procedures. One morning I showed up to the range for another day of qualifications. I was assigned to one block of shooters and was getting ready to start when I looked over at the block next to mine. That's when I saw him, the lance corporal who tried to give me that ticket. He was there to do his annual qualification. I walked over to the coach assigned to his block and asked if we could switch places. I told him I'd explain later, and he agreed without any questions. Now I was the shooting coach for the lance corporal's qualification. At first, he didn't recognize me. He was focused on getting ready for his qualification and probably wasn't looking at the coaches too closely. But I walked right up to him and got his attention. I asked him if he remembered me. He looked down at the ground and said yes. I told him he had one mistake, one tiny safety violation, and he was done. I asked him if he understood me. He nodded and didn't say anything else. I could tell he knew exactly what I was talking about. The qualification went on for the next few hours. The lance corporal went through all his rounds of shooting and actually did pretty well. His aim was solid, and he wasn't making any obvious mistakes. I watched him carefully the entire time, but he was being extra cautious with everything he did. Part of me was almost disappointed because I was hoping he'd slip up. When the shooting portion finished, all the shooters had to unload their weapons and show the coaches that their chambers were clear. This is a critical safety step and something we took very seriously. Any Marine who failed to properly clear their weapon could be thrown off the range immediately. The Lance Corporal opened his weapon and held it out toward me. I leaned in to inspect the chamber and make sure there were no rounds left inside. But before I could get a good look and verify it was actually clear, he snapped the chamber closed and started walking away from the firing line. I told him to get back. He asked what was wrong and said he showed me it was clear. I told him he closed his weapon before I could verify, and that was a safety violation. I told him to get off my range. He started yelling that it was bullshit and that I didn't even look. I repeated that he needed to get off my range and that he was done. He failed to qualify. He yelled that I couldn't do this and that it wasn't fair. I told him I was the range coach, and I said he committed a safety violation by closing his weapon before I cleared it. I told him to get off my range before I had him removed. He stood there for a few more seconds, looking like he wanted to keep arguing, but he knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. Other Marines were watching, and he was making a scene. Finally, he grabbed his gear and stormed off the range, still cursing under his breath. Failing a shooting qualification is a big deal for any Marine, but for a military policeman who carries a weapon as part of his daily duties, it's even worse. I knew his command was going to come down hard on him when they found out why he didn't qualify. A safety violation like that could mean extra duty, loss of privileges, or worse depending on how his leadership decided to handle it. I finished up the rest of the day's qualifications and went back to my barracks. I'm not usually the type to hold grudges or go out of my way to mess with people, but that Lance Corporal had tried to screw me over for no good reason. If I'd gotten that speeding ticket, it would have delayed my promotion and caused me all kinds of problems with my command. Who knows how many other Marines he'd pulled over and given bogus tickets to before that night. I've been looking forward to this dinner all week. My wife and I had been running ourselves ragged with work and errands, and we desperately needed a night out. We picked our favorite spot, this local restaurant we visit 5 or 6 times a year. The food is always great, the atmosphere is cozy, and honestly, it's become our little tradition. The only catch with this place is they don't take reservations. You can't call ahead to hold a table or anything like that. It's completely first come first served, which usually isn't a problem during the week. You walk in, give your name, and you're eating within minutes. But on weekends and holidays, it's a different story. The wait can stretch up to an hour sometimes, especially if you show up during peak hours. We arrived around 6:30 on the Saturday before Labor Day weekend. The moment we walked through the door, I could tell it was going to be busy. The waiting area near the entrance was already pretty full, with people standing around chatting and checking their phones. I walked up to the hostess stand while my wife went to find us a spot to wait. The hostess was a young woman, probably early 20s, with her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She smiled politely when I gave her our name. She told me it would be about 20 minutes for a table for 2 and asked if that was okay. I said it was perfect and thanked her. 20 minutes was nothing. We'd waited longer before, and honestly, after the week we'd had, I was just happy to be there. My wife and I found a place to stand near the wall, and I pulled out my phone to pass the time. The restaurant had this pleasant hum of conversation and clinking dishes coming from the dining room. It was actually kind of nice just to stand there and relax. About 5 minutes later, a couple came through the entrance. The woman walked directly to the hostess stand and started giving their information, but her husband didn't even pause. He just barreled past everyone in the waiting area and walked straight into the dining room like he owned the place. I watched him scan the room with his hands on his hips, clearly on some kind of mission. He zeroed in on an empty table near the back corner and immediately started heading towards it. The hostess noticed what was happening and quickly excused herself from the wife to follow him. She called after him and told him he couldn't sit there. The husband spun around with this look on his face. He told her to never mind that crap and said they'd sit at that table. He gestured dismissively toward the empty table and started pulling out a chair. The hostess's professional smile was definitely strained now, but she kept her composure. She apologized and explained that the table was out of service because they didn't have enough wait staff to cover it tonight. He asked what she meant by out of service. He pointed out there was nothing wrong with it, and the table was right there. The hostess explained they were short-staffed that evening and could only service certain sections. She repeated that the table wasn't available. By this point, everyone in the waiting area was watching. His wife had finished at the hostess stand and was standing near the entrance looking embarrassed. She walked over to him and put her hand on his arm. She told him it was only 20 minutes and asked him to just sit down. She said it wasn't a big deal. He complained loudly that 20 minutes was ridiculous and gestured at the empty table right there. The hostess maintained her professional demeanor, though I could see her jaw tighten. She said she understood his frustration but explained the wait time was the same for everyone. She asked him to have a seat in the waiting area and promised to call their name when a table was ready. He went off about how absurd this was. He ranted about empty tables and making people wait. He demanded to know what kind of operation they were running here. His voice was getting louder with each sentence. My wife and I exchanged looks. Around us, other people waiting were starting to shift uncomfortably. A few were whispering to each other. The husband launched into this whole speech about customer service and how they were paying customers and deserved better treatment. The hostess just stood there, nodding politely and repeating the same information about the table being out of service. His wife kept trying to pull him back toward the waiting area, but he wasn't having it. He announced they would take their business elsewhere. His wife pleaded with him to just wait. She reminded him the food there was always good. He refused and said it was unacceptable. He stood there for another minute, arms crossed, glaring at the hostess like she'd personally insulted him. Then he checked his watch dramatically. He declared it had been 20 minutes and suggested maybe they should go somewhere else. I looked at my phone. It had been maybe 10 minutes since they walked in. Tops. My wife leaned over and whispered in my ear. She asked me to please tell her we were nothing like that. I assured her we weren't even close. Everyone in the waiting area was thinking the same thing. Just leave already. The collective desire for this guy to actually follow through on his threat and walk out was palpable. You could feel it in the air. A few people near me were barely suppressing smirks. The wife looked absolutely exhausted, like this wasn't the first time she'd dealt with this kind of behavior. She tried one more time to reason with him, speaking quietly enough that I couldn't hear what she said. He responded by throwing his hands up and walking toward the door. He announced loudly that they were leaving. He said there were plenty of other restaurants that actually appreciated their customers. The hostess maintained her composure. She apologized that they couldn't accommodate him that evening and wished him a good night. He stormed out, and his wife followed behind him with her head down. The moment the door closed behind them, there was this collective exhale from everyone waiting. A couple near us started quietly laughing. About 10 minutes later, the hostess called our name. When we followed her to our table, I noticed it was actually the same table the husband had tried to take. Apparently, a server had just come on shift and they'd opened that section. The timing was almost poetic. We had a wonderful dinner. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.